Have you ever looked at someone and realized that they're making 10 times, maybe 20 times more money than you, and you can't figure out how that gap even exists? Not because they're smarter, not because they work 20 times harder, just somehow they're playing a different game. I remember asking myself that exact question years ago after a quiet conversation with one of my mentors. We were talking about a guy online, one of those names you'd instantly recognize if I said it out loud. I asked, half joking, "What do you think he really makes?" My mentor didn't hesitate. He said, "On a slow month, probably 600,000 or 700,000. I laughed at first, then I didn't, because this was around 2014 or 2015, and at that time numbers like that didn't exist in my world, not even close, and that question stayed with me. How does a man even arrive at that level? What I eventually discovered changed the way I see money forever. You can turn what you currently make in a year into what you make in a month, and when that clicks, it doesn't just change your income, it rewires how you think." This wasn't a cute idea or a motivational phrase. This was one of the most violent financial awakenings of my life. In fact, it was the very first real breakthrough I ever had with money, and still one of the top 3. I remember exactly when it happened, late 1990s. I was broke, frustrated, and searching. That's when I picked up a book that a lot of you have probably read, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. When I read it, something snapped into place. It felt like fog lifting, like I'd been staring at money my whole life through frosted glass, and suddenly it was clear. If I had to reduce that entire book to one sentence, it would be this: wealth is built by creating income-producing assets. That's it. The reason most men stay broke isn't laziness, it's that they themselves are the only thing producing money in their lives. When they stop, the income stops. Machiavelli warned about this centuries ago when he wrote that a man who depends entirely on his own labor is always at the mercy of circumstance. Power, he said, belongs to those who build structures that outlive effort. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They don't chase income, they accumulate assets, and income follows them. One modern thinker put it cleanly: income follows assets the way a shadow follows a body. You don't chase the shadow, you move the body. Here's where it starts to sound crazy, and I know that it is easier to make $1 million in a month than it is to make $1 million in a year. It's easier to make $1 million in a week than $1 million in a month, easier in a day than a week, easier in an hour than a day. That sounds insane until you understand leverage, and before you roll your eyes, understand this. I'm not repeating something I heard at a seminar. I'm telling you how I live. I've done all of those multiple times, and Machiavelli would nod at this because he understood something most men never learn: power concentrates, it does not distribute evenly over time. So how do I prove this without theory? Years ago, I was on a long flight across the country sitting next to a young engineer who worked in applied physics. We ended up talking for hours. At one point, I asked him what principle governed everything he studied. He smiled and said something I never forgot. He said, "All true principles repeat themselves across domains." In other words, if something works in one arena, it must work in another. Machiavelli taught the same idea in political terms: the laws of power don't change just because the stage does. So let's borrow a principle from movement. Imagine two men racing. One runs, the other rides a bicycle. The man on the bike goes farther, faster, and uses less energy. Give them both bikes and one gets a car. Same outcome. Upgrade again to a plane, then a jet. Every time the man with leverage covers more distance with less effort. The lesson is uncomfortable but simple: men who make vastly more money are not outworking you, they're out-leveraging you. They're not sprinting harder, they change vehicles. Here's the tragedy: most men were trained from childhood to respect small progress over long periods. Grind, endure, be patient. Machiavelli would call this conditioning, useful for rulers, not for builders, because if you keep men focused on slow steps, they never ask how to leap. Leveraged work will always dominate laborious work. It produces more costs, less energy, and compounds faster. Yet most people never even look for leverage. They ask what it costs. They never ask what it costs to live without it. So before we go any further, I want you to pause and reflect. Have you been trying to win by running harder or by changing vehicles? If this idea hits you, I want you to comment 1 or 2 words right now that capture it. Something simple like leverage or different game. Lock the thought in, and if this way of thinking resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe and join a growing community of men who are done playing small, visible games and are learning to build power quietly, intelligently, and on their own terms. Because in the next few minutes we're going deeper into how leverage actually works, why most people resist it, and how the same principle governs wealth, power, and control everywhere you look. Once you understand that leverage changes outcomes, the next question becomes unavoidable: why doesn't everyone use it? Why do so many men keep running when better vehicles clearly exist? The answer sits deeper than money. It lives in how people are taught to think. After that flight conversation years ago, the one with the engineer, I couldn't stop replaying what he said in my head. If a principle is true, it must hold everywhere. If it doesn't transfer, it isn't a principle. Machiavelli built his entire worldview on this idea. He studied war, politics, and human behavior not as separate games but as mirrors of the same underlying rules. Once you see that, you start noticing patterns everywhere. I remember reading a book years later about innovation and Creative dominance focused on how certain leaders seem to bend reality while others just follow it. One example that stuck with me wasn't about technology at all, it was about perspective. The author explained how the most disruptive thinkers don't invent from nothing, they recombine ideas from unrelated fields, they steal principles from one arena and weaponize them in another. Machiavelli did this in reverse, pulling lessons from ancient Rome and applying them to Renaissance politics. Same move, different stage. That's why the transportation metaphor matters so much. It isn't cute, it isn't motivational, it's structural. If one man runs and another rides, the rider wins. If both ride and one drives, the driver wins. If both drive and one flies, the one who flies wins. Distance, speed, and effort are not equalized by fairness, they're determined by leverage. Nature doesn't care how hard you try, it rewards efficiency. Power works the same way. Machiavelli wrote that fortune favors those who know how to bend conditions, not submit to them. The man who insists on fairness will always lose to the man who understands force multipliers. Here's where most people short circuit. They hear this and immediately think that's not fair. Exactly. Power has never been fair. Wealth has never been fair. Fairness is a moral concept. Money is a mechanical one. The marketplace doesn't reward exhaustion, it rewards positioning. When someone makes 10 times more than you, it's not because they're 10 times more virtuous or disciplined, it's because they've placed themselves in a position where effort scales instead of caps. They change the system they're operating inside, but conditioning runs deep. From the time you were young, you were trained to associate progress with small, steady steps. Show up, try harder, stay longer, wait your turn. That programming works perfectly if the goal is obedience. It works terribly if the goal is freedom. Machiavelli warned that systems survive by convincing people that slow suffering is noble. Once men internalize that belief, they stop searching for exits, they stop asking how to compress time. This is why leveraged work scares people. It exposes a painful truth. If leverage exists, then grinding harder was never the solution, and that's a hard pill to swallow because many men have built their identity around effort. They take pride in exhaustion, they wear burnout like a badge. So when you suggest leverage, they don't argue logically, they react emotionally. They say things like leverage costs money, or I don't have time to learn that, or that sounds risky. What they're really saying is, if this is true, then I've been playing the wrong game. Here's the question they never ask themselves: what is it costing you to not have leverage? What is the price of staying where you are for another 5 years, another decade? Machiavelli would say that delay is one of fortune's favorite traps. Men wait for certainty. Power moves while they hesitate. Learning leverage always feels expensive up front because it forces you to slow down in a world that worships motion, but running in the wrong direction faster doesn't get you anywhere. Sometimes the most aggressive move is to stop, think, and reposition. Most people say they don't have time to learn leverage. That excuse only works once. A year later it becomes negligence. You can learn almost anything in 12 months if your survival depends on it. The truth is, people don't avoid leverage because it's complicated, they avoid it because it requires admitting that effort alone won't save them. And once you admit that, you're responsible for changing. So the real fork in the road looks like this: you can keep doing what you've always done, working harder, upgrading your running shoes, and hoping something changes, or you can pause long enough to acquire a new vehicle. Pay for leverage if you have to, learn how to use it if you must, because once you understand this principle you can't unsee it, and staying in the same place becomes a conscious decision, not an accident. Before we move on, I want you to check in with yourself. Do you agree with this, or does it make you uncomfortable? Both reactions matter. Drop a comment with one word that captures how this landed for you, something like truth, resistance, or awakening. Your response tells you more about where you are than you might think, because now we're going to break down exactly where money actually comes from, why most effort is capped by design, and how wealth only begins once you cross a specific invisible line. Once you accept that leverage matters more than effort, the next question becomes obvious: where exactly does leverage come from? This is where most men get confused because they've been taught the wrong measuring stick. They believe that if they deliver more value, they should automatically be paid more money. Sounds logical, it's also mostly false. More value at the wrong level doesn't create exponential income, it just creates exhaustion. Machiavelli warned about this without using modern language when he observed that men who serve well are often rewarded with more service, not more power. Value is not flat, it's stacked. There are levels to value, and they are not equal. If you don't understand which level you're operating on, you can work yourself into the ground and still stay stuck. The lowest level is implementation. This is where most people live their entire lives. On this level, you trade your physical effort multiplied by time for money. You lift, carry, fix, type, drive, assemble. Nothing wrong with honest work, but understand the limitation. Your body is a physical resource, time is a finite resource. Multiply two limited things together and you will always get a limited result. That's not an opinion, that's math, that's reality. This is what it means to be running financially. You only move when you're moving, you only earn when you're present. When you want more money, the only lever you know how to pull is more hours, more effort, more strain. When that stops working, you buy better running shoes, you switch jobs, you get another certification, you go back to school. Same model, same ceiling. Machiavelli would call this dependence. A man dependent on his own labor has no margin, no leverage, and no protection from fortune. The next level up is unification. This is where you manage people instead of doing everything yourself. Here you're using organization, coordination, and delegation instead of one person's effort. You're multiplying effort through others. This is leverage by Delegation, and yes, it's better. Income rises, the range expands. You might go from barely surviving to doing fairly well, but there's still a ceiling. You're still limited by how many people you can manage and how much time you can oversee them. You're no longer running, but you're still pedaling. This is where many people stop and think they've made it. Machiavelli would say they've only secured a minor post, not sovereignty. A critical mindset shift happens here, and it's one you should adopt immediately. Floors matter more than ceilings. You want a minimum you refuse to drop below, not a maximum you're afraid to exceed. Most people do the opposite. They set invisible ceilings because deep down they don't believe they're allowed to rise past them. Now here's the line: most people never cross above this line. Wealth actually begins. The next level is communication. This is where income detaches from physical effort. At this level you use words to create value, and that sounds strange to people who've been taught that real work is hard, sweaty, and painful. They ask, how can talking make more money than lifting bricks or driving trucks? Because money doesn't pay for difficulty, it pays for impact, it pays for reach, it pays for influence. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. He wrote that whoever controls perception controls reality. Communication moves people, it shapes belief, it coordinates action at scale. That's why a single speech can mobilize nations while 1,000 laborers remain replaceable. Language is not physical, it's psychological, and psychology scales. Money itself proves this. There is nothing physically backing modern currency, no gold, no silver. It has value because we collectively believe the message printed on it. Belief and language are invisible forces, and invisible forces move the world. Think about it. Actors, writers, speakers, leaders, negotiators, and persuaders earn more not because they work harder, but because their words move more people. Even when the message is fictional, the money is real. So imagine the leverage when the message actually helps, teaches, or transforms. The tragedy is that most people were trained early not to speak. Be quiet, don't interrupt, don't stand out. Talking gets you in trouble. Over time that conditioning hardens into identity. I'm not a communicator. That belief alone has cost people fortunes. Above communication sits the highest level, imagination. This is where ideas, capital, and vision combine. Here money is used to create more money. Systems are designed, structures are built. This is where dynasties are formed. Machiavelli described this as the domain of founders and rulers, not servants. At this level, even what once felt like extraordinary income starts to look small because perspective has changed. Limits dissolve when imagination replaces obedience. And here's the uncomfortable truth: the only real constraints at this level live in your mind. They are self-imposed. Break stories you absorbed early about who you're allowed to be, how far you're allowed to go, and what's realistic for someone like you. Once those dissolve, ceilings vanish. Before we move on, I want you to pause and reflect on this framework. Where have you been operating most of your life? Implementation, management, communication. Drop a comment with one word that represents the level you're currently on, not where you want to be, where you actually are. That honesty matters, because in the final few moments we're going to talk about imagination, decision, and how men actually turn years of income into months once they cross that final threshold. Once you understand the top level of value, imagination, something strange happens. Numbers that once felt massive suddenly feel small, not because you're greedy, but because your frame has expanded. I remember a period years ago when I thought I had figured money out. I was making more in a month than anyone around me. My expenses were low, my lifestyle felt elevated, and I was convinced I had arrived. Then I attended a private wealth event and shared my progress with one of the senior speakers. He listened, politely nodded, and said something that hit me like a slap. He said, "You're doing well, but you're standing right before a much bigger door." I felt offended for about 10 seconds, then I felt curious. That curiosity changed my life. Machiavelli would describe that moment as the collapse of a false ceiling. He warned that men often mistake comfort for conquest. Imagination is dangerous because it exposes how artificial your limits really are. At this level, money is no longer tied to effort or even communication alone. It's tied to vision, structure, and capital movement. You're no longer asking, how do I earn more? You're asking, what can I build that earns without me? That question separates earners from architects. This is also where recession talk stops mattering. Men above this line don't participate in economic downturns the same way, not because they're immune, but because they're aggressive when others freeze. Machiavelli taught that fortune favors decisiveness, especially in chaos. While others pull back, the imaginative expand. They acquire, they position, they move capital where fear creates discounts. That's why the largest fortunes are often built in unstable times, not stable ones. Here's the shift most people never make. They think progress comes from choice. Choice feels flexible, safe, but choice leaves exits open. Decision is different. To decide means to cut off alternatives. Machiavelli was blunt about this. Hesitation breeds weakness. Once a man truly decides who he will become, circumstances rearrange around that certainty. Excuses lose their power, external obstacles shrink. The only thing left is execution, and this is where people start reaching for identity-based excuses. Gender, race, background, industry, none of them hold up under scrutiny. History is full of men who rose in hostile conditions because they refused to internalize the limits around them. The prison is not the environment, it's the interpretation of it. When You believe a boundary exists outside you. You act constrained when you realize it exists inside you. You dissolve it. Now let's get practical. When people see the highest levels of wealth, they often assume you have to be a global celebrity, an actor, a singer, a superstar athlete, but those paths are rare and fragile. They rely on youth, timing, and external approval. Machiavelli would never advise building power on something you don't control. The more reliable path is communication, writing, teaching, speaking, publishing, reporting back to the marketplace what you've learned and tested. I didn't start out with a master plan. I started by sharing ideas. Years ago, I wrote a book without knowing if anyone would care. I invested in learning how to distribute it properly, not because I was special, but because I understood leverage. When it sold more than expected, something clicked. The book wasn't the asset, the message was. The same thing happened later with video. I spoke for years before I ever made a dollar from it. When monetization finally entered the picture, it compounded decades of practice almost overnight. That's how leverage works. It looks slow until it isn't. Here's what most people miss: you don't get paid for how hard something is, you get paid for how many people it reaches and how deeply it moves.